just you. Because I know why you're sitting and listening. I don't know the reasons of why everybody else is here, but I know your reason. That's what I'm telling you. Hear me? Hear me? Hear me? Hear me? Hear me? It's hear me. Don't you want to get one? Oh, you do? Where are you getting this?
Well, actually, one of the guys was my friend from Houston. But maybe went to one of the meetings the other day.
But who's writing this?
That's the editorial board.
CID? Who does the editorial work? The faculties, huh?
Not all of them. He's last
Oh, really? Okay, what is Mamadou? Hey, hi, how are you? Where is Mamadou? I'm gonna sit and listen. A little bit. Yes.
We haven't bumped into each other.
Well, his attitude is in some ways very like mental
But you can leave it.
mental muscle person because I think he has a sense of respect for the elder. Just hated for some reason. But
Tell me. I don't think other than that. I don't know. Yeah, I'm graduating May. But you need to distribute things. Like last time. I'm keeping some stuff for Esteban. Actually, he left me his food. Like, you guys can yeah, I know. It's kind of civic food, but how nice. How was it? She was a bad I mean, I saw when she was a baby, but
twice a week is enough for you?
It's probably safer clip to this. This tends to slip when you clip it to that. Okay. I'll have that glass without the water, without the ice in it. Okay, as long as it doesn't fall off again.
Welcome to the Forum on After the Riots is Islamic Law and the Future of Nigeria. This is not a branch of the Miss World contest. This has very little to do with it, but of course the riots began there. Nigeria, as you all know, is the home of at least 120 million people. It's the most populous and the most important state in Africa, and perhaps the most troubled and disturbed state in Africa. And that's why we're holding the forum to discuss some of these issues. And it's a forum sponsored by the Program on Interstate Conflict of the Kennedy School, by the Harvard Student Africa Caucus, the Kennedy School Student Africa Caucus, by the Belfer Center and the Kennedy School Women's and Public Policy Program and the Kennedy School Center for International Development. Now, as Nigeria goes, so goes Africa. Or to be more cautious, Nigeria's success would, all of us I think would agree, contribute to the success of Africa. Several dozen Nigerian experts and experts on Nigeria are sitting in the front row of the forum. We're glad they're here. They're part of a meeting with which the Program on Interstate Conflict is holding this weekend at the Kennedy School to look at the possibility for sustainable change in Nigeria. Tonight, however, we're taking one section of that meeting and focusing on it, which is the place of Islamic law in a plural society. And as to be the lead in a conversation, which we will hold off in the next 30 minutes or so, we have three of the conference participants who will examine the subject in detail in the extended conversation. Then we'll have a dialogue with all of you and with the floor. And the first of the panelists immediately to my left, Dr. Aisha Imam, who is a researcher and lecturer in sociology and women's studies in Nigeria, in the UK, in Canada, and in Senegal. She's the founding executive director of Baobab, an NGO for women's human rights. And just a few weeks ago, she received the John Humphrey Freedom Award for over 20 years of activism in researching and defending women's rights in Nigeria. Dr. Ayo Obe is a private legal practitioner and the president of the Civil Liberties Organization of Nigeria since 1995. She serves on various international and Nigerian boards and works as a human rights NGO representative on the Public Service Commission of her country. And third, Dr. Leo Modibo Umar, who has a doctorate from our university friend in the Southwest, UCLA, and has been a lecturer at the University of Abuja in his capital city, and has the distinction of being a special assistant in the office of the President of Nigeria, not in this presidential regime, and not in the previous one, but in both, and from 1994. So he is one of the Nigerians who has lived through severe change. Now, what I'd like to do is start by asking our panelists a general question, and then they will speak and answer this question, and we'll move on to questions which flow from that. Clearly, the Islamic law question has been in the news in Nigeria and in the world. But the question, I think, to start with is, how does Islamic law in Nigeria and Islamic law generally fit in with the secular history of the country and with its constitution? How does it fit in what has developed since independence 42 years ago, and how Nigeria has evolved? Please, Aisha.
The thing about going first is sometimes you feel you have to cover all the points, but I know that there are two people here who are very capable, so I'm not going to even try to cover everything. I'm going to raise a point that perhaps might not otherwise be raised instead. And that is that I think it's quite important to bear in mind what is the nature of the subject we're talking about. Because very often when people say Islamic law, they think of some eternal, directly God-given code that is changeless and unchangeable. And in fact, that's not what has ever been the case. And in principle, it can't be. All the schools of fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, were developed many decades after the revelation of the Quran and after the death of the Prophet. The body of laws, which are quite diverse in time and in place, that is collectively referred to as Sharia, can be seen to have differences both amongst the schools and within the schools, and in terms of what different Muslim societies have actually done with them. So I think that it helps the discussion if we refer to what place does Muslim laws have in secular systems. Okay? And in terms of that, the history of Nigeria is that, in fact, on certain aspects, Muslim laws have always been present in at least what are now the 19 states of Nigeria in family laws. So what we're talking about now is the introduction of Sharia legislation, or legislation attributed to Muslim laws, in certain criminal offences. Okay? And in relation to that, there are certain issues around the Constitution guaranteeing both the freedom of expression of religion and that no state will adopt any state religion. And there are a whole number of grey areas in terms of the drafting of the words of the Constitution that lead people to argue both that if religious laws, or laws that are expressly ascribed to religion, are not applied to non-Muslims, then in fact it's not an adoption of state religion. But on the other hand, in the implementation, we have seen clearly that religious laws have been applied to non-Muslims. So that, I think, is a problem.
Okay, Obe. Thank you.
I think that from my perspective as somebody practicing law, mostly in Lagos State, the introduction of, I should call it the extension of Sharia law, because one has to recognize that, firstly, that Sharia law has been in Nigeria for quite some time. And in the paper that I wrote for the meeting that's taking place, I tried to draw parallels between the way in which Islamic law came to Nigeria, met existing customary systems, and to some extent, it changed those customary systems, and to some extent, it itself adapted to accommodate those customary systems of law. And that when the British colonizers came, they also met both the customary systems, the indigenous systems of law, and the Islamic system, which was called the Maliki system. And again, it changed the customary and the Islamic, and at the same time, it's itself adapted and changed to meet. So that, and I think that the point that Dr. Imam makes about, notwithstanding the fact that a Supreme Court judge recently described the Sharia law as certain, and it's not certain. I mean, a lawyer would rarely concede that anything is certain and fixed and immutable. But it's quite clear that in the history of the way that Islamic law has been applied in Nigeria, it hasn't been fixed and immutable. It has, in fact, adapted and changed to meet the varying circumstances, not just of customary law within Nigeria, not just of the colonial system of law that was brought by the British, but also in the context of the wider Islamic world. When Nigeria was to have its independence in 1960, for example, you had the situation where the implementation of Islamic law had been left largely untouched, except that punishments such as amputation and stoning were not applied during the time of British colonialism. And I have to say that I'm not able to say what the situation was before the British colonialists, but that the implementation had led to a situation where things which would have been a crime under Islamic law, and might even have been a crime of manslaughter, for example, under British law, were left in a situation where the person was either convicted of murder under Islamic law or not at all, and they were let off, so that a lot of Islamic jurists and scholars were dissatisfied with the way that the law was being implemented. And so on the eve of independence, the government of northern state of Nigeria did go out to see what is happening in the wider Islamic world. And they found that, and from that, they came up with the penal code. The penal code wasn't imposed, but it was nonetheless, it was an adaptation again. It was a kind of accommodation in the political context of wanting to have an independent Nigeria, not wanting to seem to insist rigidly on wholesale implementation of Islamic law. And I think that really holds the key to the issue, that there has always been, up until now, accommodation, compromise on both sides. To the extent that in Lagos State, for example, even the civil personal law of Muslims don't have that right, because it's a political issue, so that a Muslim in Lagos State cannot have his inheritance or marriage issues determined according to Islamic law under a Sharia court, whereas unless he goes to a sort of what is in effect a private arbitration. But I think in order to sort of stop talking forever, is that I think that the fundamental issue now is to what extent, and this is the perception from the non-Islamic part of the country, is that is the constitution supreme or not? So that, for example, if the constitution, and to me it's not really a matter of not adopting a state religion or adopting a state religion, it's a matter of accepting that the constitution is supreme. Whatever the interpretation is going to be, that the constitution is supreme. And that constitution is ipso facto not a creation of Islam. And that therefore, and so that my perspective is that whilst, and this was really the point that arose from the attempts to save those who have been condemned to death by stoning, and earlier to those who have been condemned to flogging and to amputation, is that people have been forced to argue, or have argued at any rate, within the context of what is acceptable and ideal in Islam. And my question is that, are we striving for the ideal Islamic state under the constitution, or are we striving to interpret the existing laws as they are? The Sharia laws, you know, the law implementing the Sharia in Zamfara state or Sokoto state, in the context of the constitution. In other words, do we accept that the constitution is supreme? Or do we say that, well, since our ideal is to interpret Islamic law, then if the constitution doesn't agree with it, we have to disregard the constitution. And that, of course, leads us to the question of this constitution anyway. At which point I'll stop.
Dr. Omar, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Robert. My two colleagues, Aisha and Ayo, have dwelled extensively on the legal and the constitutional aspect of Sharia. I will take a diversion to talk about the salient and the sociological reasons as to the rise of the Sharia as of now. Why did it get projected to this stage at the material time? why was it not so much in focus or in vogue during past administrations or regimes? I think we can understand that by perhaps speculating a little bit or by looking at some of the trends in Nigeria as of recent, vis-a-vis the rise of certain Islamic movements, and also, on the other hand, what a lot of people have not really gotten to debate about, the rise or the progressive rise of Christian fundamentalism as well. So what you are looking at is the Muslim aggressiveness and Christians' assertiveness. And the Christian assertiveness really came in recent years as a result of the introduction of certain churches in Nigeria, the Pentecostal church, the rise of the Pentecostalism as opposed to other traditional churches, and I think to a large extent has brought sharp opposition or sharp focus in terms of this opposition or question about Sharia law. As for Muslims, we have over the years, since the late 70s, actually started just about the period when General Gawan was in power, there was a sort of resurgence or reawakening of or what you may call a rebirth of Islam in Nigeria. And this came through the Izala movements. And when the Izala movement split into several factions, and of course, for some of you that are familiar with Islam in Nigeria, you already had the traditional Tariqa movements and then the Izala movements. The Izala movements, by and large, started as an urban elite movement, urban Muslim elite movement, because the primary home of the Izala was Kaduna. Even though it was spearheaded by Sheikh Mahmoud Gumi, enlightened Muslim elites joined the movement, became conversant, became what you may call born again, just like in the Christian religion, born again Muslims, and became a little bit strong about the religion they wanted to know. Now, during the constitution drafting process of 1977, by and large, for those of you that are conversant with that period, the intense debate about the Sharia, the inclusion of the Sharia in our constitution, took place at that time. It even actually threatened the fabric of the unity of Nigeria. Somehow a compromise was reached, and it went on. During the Shagari regime, none of the state governors bothered to introduce Sharia. That also is another point by itself, because that period, the depression was not as much as now, and the atmosphere was a little bit much more mundane or docile, so to speak. Now, this also point of the enlightened urban Muslim elite, because I was there during the Abdul Salam regime, during the debate on the constitution, the drafted constitution, and actually the strong proponents of the Sharia clause in the constitution as of that time were the military officers that, even though you had a division too, you had certain military officers of northern Christian military officers that really objected to it, but the strong push, the insistence that it should be in the constitution was spearheaded by these urban young military officers of Muslim extraction. Now, after the transition of 1999 and the rise of the agitation, because actually throughout the campaigning period there was no agitation for Sharia law, it was just incidental, so to speak. It became a political opportunism for the governors that introduced it. even though for the key political actors it was an opportunistic act, but for the masses across the length and breadth of northern Nigeria, it was sort of like an alternative to already a worsening condition. The common Nigerian, the common average Muslim, thought that Sharia or the introduction of Sharia will curb or minimize the vices, because there's this fundamental belief by most Muslims that, and even some Christians, some pious Christians, that do believe Nigeria did not, tilt towards the precipice, so to speak, because of some godly people in the country. That the only way to salvage the nation is to return to this Puritanism of introducing laws ordained by God, that laws that will purge the society of corrupt tendencies, of certain immoralities. And so that is what gave rise to this agitation. Now, the opportunity came when Ahmed Sani of Zamfara State, predominantly Islamic state in the northwestern part of Nigeria, introduced that. But what was interesting is that during the day of the launching of the Sharia in Zamfara, because it happened, the process started for about a month. There was a lot of campaigning across the country, a lot of announcements that the Sharia will be launched in Zamfara. And people actually embarked on from as far as some parts of the northeastern part of the country, about 1,000 kilometers or more, to trek, not to even, because they thought they were doing a pious thing, to trek all the way to Gusau to be part of this momentous occasion. Now, from that moment, the movement was taken over from the politicians. From the politician, he at that moment lost control of the movement. Now, what may be interesting to us at this material time is perhaps to ask that has the expectation of the average Muslim of Sharia, has it been met? Now, if it has not been met, what does it entails, and what does it portends to democracy in Nigeria? I think I must stop at that.
Okay, let's continue with that thought, because that is one of the central questions, and I think we're being maybe a bit too civil at the moment, and we want to get at why this question is so heated in Nigeria, and you're starting, I think, to get at it, and maybe you'd like to continue.
Yes, I think that I'd agree that there was a level of popular support in the north amongst Muslim communities, but also in the southwest, amongst Muslim communities in the southwest, for the idea of Muslim laws, as we said earlier in the meeting, because of, not simply because of religious identity, that's clearly part of it, but also because there was the feeling that Muslim laws would clean up corruption, would return personal security, and would bring social justice issues. But I would really disagree with you that at the point of the enactment of the new Sharia acts, that it ceased to be the political abuse of religion for the sake of gaining power. I think that both things are continuing to happen. People are being pushed because there is clearly a support for the idea of Sharia, but also they're continuing to manipulate it. If you remember the way in which the governor of Zamfara has this coterie of young vigilante men who stand up and say, they look, and it feels very like when you're walking through them, as I have, they're standing there at the back going, Allahu Akbar, every time he speaks. So if you try to ask him any questions at all, and this was at an open meeting that he had agreed to come to, as it happens, at the Women's Center in Abuja. And none of the women were able to speak because of these young, some of whom might have been in support, but some of whom also wanted to ask him questions about it. So clearly there's still political manipulation going on. And I think the very fact that the continued attempt to portray the whole issue of raising any criticisms about either the nature of passing Sharia acts or the content of those Sharia acts as, by definition, anti-Islamic and unwarrantable is itself a political abuse in trying to close off the area of discussion and debate. And there are answers for that both in terms of secular democratic debate, which is that these people were elected on a secular democratic framework and had not campaigned on the issue from which they're now claiming legitimacy and are bound by the rules of the secular democratic framework. But there are also answers in Muslim discourse, which is the verse in the Quran about the rule of Muslims, the rule of the community of Muslims being by consultation. There was no consultation that went into those acts. So whichever discourse you take, and this is the point that Ayo was raising, that there might be a fundamental disagreement about whether or not the secular constitutional is prior, or the idea about Islam being a religion divinely ordained is prior. They actually do cohere, at least particular discourses of each of them can actually cohere in a negotiated meeting ground. But the continued political manipulation of the idea that even to talk about the content of Sharia, even to recognize that Muslim laws are and always have been, right from the Medina days, historical, political, economic products, is in itself continued political manipulation and an attempt to retain power in the name of religion.
Feel free to come back to her on that if you wish.
No.
And because you're disagreeing, I hope. I get it.
Well, if you're not, will you do it now?
Yeah, do it now, exactly, yeah.
No, I mean, the point is that it's right. The problem is that once you've let the genie out of the bottle, you can't just stuff it back in. And I think that's really the point. It is certainly being manipulated. But it's like, I mean, quite frankly, Governor Yarima, having gotten onto the back of the tiger, he's riding it now. He might find it a bit difficult to come down and sort of say, oh, sorry, I'm now ready to compromise. Because the issue is, firstly, is he offering anything else? I mean, when people say that religion is the opium of the masses, it is, it's not a term of abuse. It's a description of the way that it's used. For example, I asked my members the members of the CLO, I should say, they said, oh, the man had some problems. He bought some vehicles, some Jeeps, and they were asking him, you know, why did you buy all these Jeeps for yourself? And so he hit on, oh, he bought them for Islamic purposes. And then having seen how well that went, he now said, you know, this is my path to glory. And you know, the thing is that having started it, you can't put it back. I want to say, however, that the Sharia debate in Nigeria is not a new one. When during even the time of colonialism, as recently as 50 years ago, questions were being asked about, you know, how are we going to bring our laws up to date and so on. And the representatives of the emirs and so on, and of the courts, those who are administering Islamic laws, said basically we want the status quo to continue. So that, and this is just, you know, within living memory, so that one can't treat it as though it's something that's just coming afresh. However, it's not correct. So you see, when we say the issue of Sharia almost broke up the country or broke up the constitution debate during the 70s, what was being discussed then was personal law. The issue of bringing in punishments such as, issues such as segregation of men from women in public places, punishments such as amputation, punishments such as stoning, was not on the agenda. What was on the agenda was that you had Sharia courts for personal law, marriage, inheritance, divorce, civil contracts, and so on. And the question was the extent to which the appeals from those courts, the appeal courts which would deal with those appeals, would be reflected in the Constitution. That was the issue. And now, of course, because it's easier to sloganize and say Sharia or no Sharia, it became that issue. So that actually the most vocal opponents at that time were the people from the Middle Belt who were, as it were, at the cutting edge of the implementation.
Where do we go from here? What's the future of Nigeria with 12 states adopting the Sharia with all the questions you've raised?
Well, I think the first thing is that the idea of running away from letting the matter go before the courts is in itself, it's wrong. I mean, it's true, as I said, I mentioned the Supreme Court judge who talked about the certainty of Islam and so on. But then he himself is trained in a system which he may now be at an internal war with himself over, but it has to come out. The Supreme Court has pronounced on other things which, for example, on the question of oil, onshore and offshore. And I have in previous articles made the point that many people are dissatisfied with the Constitution. The people in the South are dissatisfied with the way that the Constitution says, well, all that oil and mineral wealth belongs to the Federation of Nigeria, and we're going to take it all, collect it in Abuja, and then we're going to share it out like this. And they sort of say, well, it belongs to us, so we don't like the Constitution in that regard. We want to do the thing our own way. Now, as regards Islamic law, equally, some, let me not say all, because, I mean, I think that I agree with Aisha, the sort of silencing of people who want to say, we want to discuss this issue. We even want to discuss it within an Islamic context is one of the tragedies of the debate, as far as I'm concerned. But those who say we want to have Sharia law, well, the Constitution, insofar as the Constitution doesn't agree with us, we don't agree with the Constitution either. But the point is that where the people in the South were left at the end of the day, they are not controlling their oil. The people who are the proponents of extension of Islamic law are basically perceived as doing what they like, and as the central government, and to an extent the court system, saying, well, you know, we don't want to touch that because you know, the Muslims might get excited, might get annoyed. And I think also that things like what happened recently with the Miss World debate, it presents Muslims as though no sense of humor, no tolerance for any opposing ideas. Every Muslim prays 5 times a day, fasts like Bilio during Ramadan, and it's a perfect, and of course we know that isn't true. But the presentation is that, no, so that the nature of the debate is so circumscribed. And I think that it's so important that people are allowed to reclaim the debate first, before we even talk about what is the solution, how do we agree? Because as I said, I think that we need to go to the issue of constitutional debate. After all, when we had independence, the purported interpretation of Islam was that women could not be voted for, not have the vote. That was alleged to be what the religion required. And that was in the Constitution. So that in the constitutional provision on freedom from discrimination, sex or gender was not mentioned as one of the grounds on which you could not be discriminated against. It is now, in the 1979 and the current Constitution, gender is there. But it wasn't at independence. So that we can discuss it. And that's because when the debate was going on in northern Nigeria, and I can't say the extent to which women participated in that debate, by the way, but when the debate was going on, this was what came up from the grassroots and then went to the center. So that to me, unless we start off and say, whether it's at the regional or state or even the local government area, what do we want in our constitution? So that if then the people from some states say, this is what we want, non-negotiable, negotiable, we're just putting it there for the purposes of discussion, then you can have it. But if you don't allow other Muslims who don't have this idea, which even incidentally Yerima himself cannot seriously be upholding, given the levels of corruption in every single government in the Federation of Nigeria.
we have to recognize that the Sharia at the moment may fall within the rubric of the political opportunism. But the reality on ground is that the agitation for pure Sharia will continue unabated, largely because all the variables that made the society, those particular societies, to agitate for Sharia are there. There's massive poverty, there's insecurity, there's massive corruption, and by and large, the people or the foundation of Sharia, which are the common person, is that think that Sharia is going to rid them of these problems. Now, the issue is that are the courts, the Sharia courts, competent to adjudicate in this respect? At the moment, there's a lot of weakness in the system, you know. But the beauty of the layers of authority in Nigeria is that there are certain structures. It's just like with the confusion with the death sentence passed on the stoning of Amin Al-Lawal. A friend of mine wrote on the internet, and she wanted me to email me, and she wanted to know what are the implications. Will this woman really die of stoning or something like that? And I explained to her that the process is not over. There are layers of authority. There are other interpretations, similar to what happened with the fatwa. After the Miss World thing, the journalist, you know, the governor just came out of nowhere and said that this woman should be, and the supreme body of Islamic affairs said that this is totally wrong. And we were walking down here, Professor Peden was telling me that he just was looking into the Zamfara State Penal Code. And actually there is a law there that says that if you are in authority, and if you pronounce the fatwa wrongly, you are liable to go to jail for 7 years. So we'll see what happens. Because even though the deputy governor of Zamfara State has immunity at the moment, so the question of Sharia will continue to be refined. But that notwithstanding will not stop the assertiveness that I've said. I've pointed out, because now before Aisha comes in, I just want to illustrate this. The Muslims' tradition or requirement is that you pray in congregation. Now, even if you're in public institution or public places, you do perform that. That is why when you go to Nigeria or any other Islamic country, you find in offices there will be a mosque, even if it is a makeshift. But of recent, a couple of years ago, a trend started. Christians also demanded for a prayer ground in certain public places. And when you say that, well, but you are not required to pray in congregation, they easily cite and say, well, but Muslims are doing it. You know, so it is common practice when you go to the Federal Secretariat, for instance, an office will be devoted, or an official will just devote his office to certain to Christian prayer as well, in congregation, every morning, not on Sundays only. So it is this competing interest that has to be, you know, examined properly, because as long as there's this competing interest, and as long as a group feels that it is being shortchanged, then it will not even give the benefit of the doubt or the moment to understand what...
I think we would all be in agreement that as long as any group feels that it's being shortchanged, there are going to be problems. And I would imagine that we would also be in agreement that people are going to have to talk, that the debate has to be opened up, both within Muslim or religious or Tiv or Igbo or Hausa or whatever communities, as well as across the nation. And I think that in response to what both you and I have said, it is, I think, heartening that in fact people, particularly on the issue of Muslim laws, are beginning to refuse to be silenced. We have people for example, not just the Supreme Council of Islamic Affairs, but many other, quote-unquote, ordinary Muslims saying, not in our name. What happened was not about, we don't have our support for doing that. And not simply the, educated elite, but also, one of the women who was convicted and sentenced to stoning, Safia Tungo Tudu, I work for an organization that supports some of the victims, that works on women's human rights, and so we picked up some of the cases of people who've been convicted under the new Sharia acts. And when we went to Safia's village, the villagers hid her because they didn't know who we were and they didn't trust us, and they thought maybe the person who actually went was a man, okay? And they thought maybe he was coming to pick her up for implementation. So there was a very clear sense, even at the level of quote-unquote uneducated, ignorant villagers who support the idea of Muslim laws in principle, that what is being done in the name of Muslim laws is not necessarily correct, even if it's been done by Sharia laws. So I think that that's something that we should see as a hopeful sign, but that we should continue to build on that sense that we have to discuss the content of what goes on. There's far too much suggestion that, for example, we necessarily have to have stoning. Stoning is not mentioned in the Quran anywhere. It was people who developed that out of it, and it developed out of what was at the time a custom of some Arab tribes and of the Jews. Now, if the Jews can leave it behind, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to leave it behind. It's not, in Muslim history, the second caliph abrogated the punishment for theft because he pointed out that in a situation of extreme poverty, you could not possibly have amputation. Okay, so the idea that there's one set punishment, it has to be implemented anyhow, and that even to talk about it is apostasy. Or I've never been asked so many times in my life, "Are you a Muslim?" Since I started talking publicly about the defects in the Sharia laws. Okay, but the Malik himself said, "I am but a man. I may be right, I may be wrong. Examine it." And in his name, other people are being told not to examine it. This is ridiculous, especially in a situation, and it's recognized in most Muslim discourses that if you're in a situation where you are not only Muslims, then you do not impose Muslim law on everybody. So,
let me just ask a final question to the three of you, and then we'll open up the questions to the audience. Given the division between North and South, given the hot quality of the discussion on the Sharia, given the riots and so on, can Nigeria stay together?
I think the one thing that and it's interesting the extent to which something that would be perceived as not trivial, I mean, after all, it's another form of entertainment, as the Miss World contest has underlined questions for people. Because I think that what happened when the journalist made the mistake of suggesting that the Prophet might have married a wife was that people who are not Muslims started to say, if this is how bad it is, what's the point of is there a future for us? Can we in fact stay together? And also, I have to say that the issue of the complaint about the competition itself was one thing, because I think that it sort of exposed the hypocrisy of people like Mohammed Buhari, who was saying that that Sharia law is only for Muslims, and then, but this thing mustn't happen during Ramadan and so on. And then, when the fatwa was pronounced, there was almost a deafening silence. Even people, when the Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs came out and said, well, no, it's not correct, they all took time out to condemn the journalist. Of course, the president Obasanjo had laid the foundation by also talking about irresponsible journalism and so on. And a lot of people cannot see what is the irresponsibility there. So that there's, as if we're all now sort of saying, wait a minute. If it gets to, like when I was coming here, I was reading this magazine, Private Eye, it's a British satirical magazine. There's a cartoon in it. And its cartoon has Rappy Christmas. And what the, you've got sort of Joseph and Mary and the baby, and Joseph is in his rap, he told, forgive me for not being able to reproduce it. He's saying, yo, baby, my woman been stuffed up with some dude's baby, something of that nature. And, of course, one laughed. But,
Blasphemy.
well, I know, yeah, that's the point. You see, it is, there are ways in which, so that people can sort of say, I can say, yes, as a Christian, I can see the humor in it. And as I said, the impression is being created, which, I mean, quite frankly, I lived in Yaba, surrounded by Muslims. As if there's no sense of humor, there's no capacity for people to make innocent jokes, malicious jokes, honest, it's a wrong...
Ayo, I think to be fair, a lot of the reactions that I've seen, at least those that have been coming out of through email, and the reports I've seen of newspaper articles have been saying, we found it offensive, but nonetheless, it does not mean that that the office should have been burnt down, that 200 people should have died, or that she should be threatened with death. I mean, people can say, I found it offensive, without saying, we think that this warrants somebody being put to death.
It's not only offensive. We cannot use ourselves, the three of us here, as yardstick on gauging public opinion about Sharia. Really, because we are urban enlightened elites, we at Harvard and everything.
Very enlightened.
But really, the average man, you have to go into the mind of the average Muslim and what Islam says about this.
Well, that's exactly the point, you see. I think this idea that you have to go into the mind of the average Muslim and understand it.
The average Muslim is a woman who might well have
I
found
don't know
it
about
funny.
whether she's a woman or a man or a child or a...
I mean, the real point is that to what extent do we have to understand totally before we can live together?
It is a reality out there that people do feel offended, and there is, if you do believe in the religion, there is a sanction for it. That is, but see, what we have to understand...
Not for non-believers.
No, seriously,
The sanction is not for non-believers.
Excuse me. What we have to understand, though, is the background, what led to this frustration. What led to this frustration. I saw an editorial in one of the Nigerian papers, The Guardian, and it captured it slightly, because it says that even to the non-Muslim, even though they condemn the killings, they condemn the overreaction, but even to the non-Muslims at one time were wondering why the Miss Wall is being held for certain reasons. Because first of all, there was overly involvement of government in the affair. Yeah. And really, Muslims, Obasanjo at the helm, made certain people uncomfortable. And Obasanjo proclaiming during his coming that he is a born again, made certain Muslims feel that, maybe Christians are being favored. So when there was these ministers at the airport, 3 ministers receiving Mrs. Wall, or Miss Wall, then you had television for about, state-run media for about 3 to 4 months, running commercials, free of charge. A lot of, these are things, the debate that you don't really hear. But when you go to the Malam by the table, or the Malam that listens to the BBC.
A good many Christians would also object to the waste of state money on this.
Okay, coming back to your question, whether will Nigeria stay together? Because it is a fundamental question. And it is my view that as long as there's a convergence of elite interests, Nigeria will always remain together.
Okay, let's
sorry, I mean, I have to say something. You see, let me say that when we were hosting a football competition, men running around in shorts,
and the amount of money that's wasted on it.
I mean, quite frankly, the entire machinery of government was at the disposal of this entertainment. Of course, it's, as they say, everything else is mere detail. But nonetheless, for some people, cannot say what is the difference. And for us to have to now start knowing. I remember being in a case where we were actually discussing the position of Ahmadiyya movement in Islam and so on. And I remember Justice Kayode Shaw, in writing his judgment, he went out of his way. Every time he mentioned Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him. And yet I can drive in the streets of Lagos, I can see somebody with a car sticker saying, Allah is the one true God. He never dies, not even for 3 days. So that it's a two-way street. And the point is that if we are going to have to now start to sort of be the alpha and omega of the sensitivities of different religious groups, then we have to ask ourselves, can we in fact? Now, to me, I think we can. We don't have to know everything, and that people just have to learn to take the notes. Just as if you're living in the United States, people may say something about your religion which you won't like. You live with it, because this is where you're living. And it's the same thing. People, the inherent tolerance that people have is being pressed down, and people are being encouraged to be intolerant. I mean, my executive director was on a radio program. He said he doesn't believe in stoning. Of course, in the CLO, we don't believe in the death sentence. And the other person on the program said, well, you better examine your faith. And he said, my name is Abdul Rahman. It means servant of the compassionate, servant of the merciful. I think that expression means something. But here we are being given this idea that we've got to know everything about it, and we can't.
Let's open it up. We have two mics, and what we do here is to line up behind the mics, and we'll try to get in as many questions. There's a mic up there too. We'll try to get in as many questions as we can. Keep them short so we can have a dialogue, and please, if you're going to make a statement rather than a question, it has to be very, very short. We'll start here.
Thank you. My name is Simdul Shagaya. I'm a graduate student at the business school. I think Professor Rodberg's question went largely unanswered, which is, will we stay together as a nation? You have a generation of young Nigerians like myself who were born, have only witnessed social decay since the 70s. And so I think we're forced to ask, is this a manifestation of a broader weakness in the structural integrity of the nation? I think this is something we have to ask. Despite the most well-intentioned, or the intents of well-intentioned patriots like yourself, or even General Gowon, who's sitting here, is there structural weakness in the nation? And I have to ask, I ask this question painfully, because for me, from Plateau and Delta, grew up in Kaduna and Bauchi and Gombe, but I'm still forced to ask this. Is there something fundamentally wrong with our country? And is this just a manifestation of the structural weakness of our nation? Thank you.
Would one of you like to begin with that small question, but central question?
Yeah, the answer is yes, there's something wrong, but it can be fixed.
I'm happy to go with that. The trouble is we don't always agree on what exactly needs to be fixed or how. No, not so much on what needs to be fixed.
And it is being
Most
fixed.
of us agree on that.
It is being fixed. There are processes going on that needs to be encouraged in the country. Of course, there are a lot of biases. But the problem is that this evening when we were talking in the earlier panel, and my former professor Sklar talked about the patriots. And if you know them, Williams, what is his name, the other old man, you know, a lot of them, all men, 70s and above. There was an article that Pat Utomi wrote in This Day, a couple of, is it last year or a couple of months ago? And he listed some of the young, enterprising, patriotic young men in Nigeria, honest,
Any women?
not corrupted, that should move the country forward. But they're not being given the chance. You know, the country is being held hostage by a generation that has refused to go. No new ideas are circulating in Nigeria. You know, and unless if we give the country a rebirth, like the brother was saying, you know, he's here, he's educated, he's enlightened, he's lived in multicultural Nigeria. A lot of us have done our youth service corps. The point of agreement, even if I disagree with Ayo, I wouldn't do it vehemently. But to our consternation, these older folks are the ones that are championing the ethnic militias, the ethnic separations, the sovereign national conference. Because to be fair, you know, I have not had a single young voice that says that Nigeria should disintegrate. We still do have hope. We have competent young men and women that we think can do the job if they're allowed to do so.
I'd just like to add to that. I mean, the first is a general comment that we've been held hostage not simply by a generation, but a particular gender. And the extent to which women are left out of discussions and negotiations. And one of the things that worldwide research is showing is that if women are there in numbers, there tends to be more...
Is there gender discrimination here, two women and one man?
Always. Shall we also count the number of minutes you've spoken? But seriously now, that there does tend to be, whether it's a matter of upbringing or other issues we won't discuss, but there does tend to be an attention to concretely how do we move on from here, that rather than rhetoric. For example, that it's a specifically male reaction to stress is that fight or flight reaction. Women's reaction to stress, as far as the research shows, is to reach out and to build relationships. And so it seems to me that in a situation of conflict and stress, such as we find in Nigeria, it would be extremely useful to include more women in negotiation. But that apart, it's also the case that so long as we also continue having policies like federal character that insist on our focusing on small communities, whether those are communities of ethnic identity or communities of religion, rather than on community as Nigerians, then we are going to have people looking to the boundaries, especially in the situation that we have now, where the economic situation is getting worse and worse, and your claim to community identity is also your claim to resources in the state. So unless that connection is broken, and unless and until the economic situation increases, which is not only about what's happening in Nigeria, but is also about an international economic order and a world, international financial institutions having the power to impose on us structural adjustment type programs, that too needs to be changed. So there's things that we need to do in Nigeria, but there are also things that we need to know that we have to build relationships
also a
outside.
point,
I want to get in as many questions as I can.
Just a quick point, because I want to throw it out there, so that some of us, maybe if people have answers. We cannot absolve the international community from some of the problems in Nigeria, even though I'm not saying, we are going to sit here and pass the buck. Of course, the buck stops with us. But it relates to Africa. There's inherent still, the West has to do a whole rethink about the way it relates to Africa. We are not going to sit there and wait for aid or something. What we want is fair involvement of the Western nations, free from racism, free from retrogressive thinking. That we want to be engaged constructively towards building, and we want the Western world to look at the potentials that are there in Africa and countries like Nigeria.
Okay, good. I tell you what we're going to do. In order to get in as many questions as possible, we're going to have the questions, and then we're going to turn to the panel. So we'll start here. Please identify yourself.
I'm Reginald Nabarki. I'm a research fellow here at the Du Bois Institute. I would like to question the timing of this whole Sharia law thing and the ripple effect at which it took place in the North, and compare that to the points that, you talk about corruption, and when we look at the Babangida regime was in existence throughout the 80s. Then we had the Abacha regime, which was the most corrupt regime. Yet we weren't hearing about this Sharia thing. And then we have a Christian president come in, and there's a ripple effect. I would like to understand how you think the rest of Nigeria wouldn't see through this, and how you think that other parts of fractions of Nigeria aren't, how the intensity and the tension, is it mounting that something probably is going to take place from another part of Nigeria, and instead of just always being a reactionary effect to the Muslim rage.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Omar Abdul Malik. I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School, and I'm a public service fellow. In Islam in the United States has had the effect of a reform movement pertaining to lowering drug and alcohol use and the enhancement of responsible family life. and therefore is seen in this country as a more or less positive element, especially in the African American community. On the other hand, the situation in Nigeria in regard to the implementation of Islamic law has been painted in a mostly negative context. And my question to you would be, has there been any positive effects at all? We know about the negatives, but has there been any positive effects from the implementation of Sharia in terms of changes in the behavior of the general public? And does the good outweigh the bad, or is there room for further discussion?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, my name is Felix Diawo, and I'm from Ghana. I'm a fellow of MIT Urban and Regional Studies Special Program, which I finished in '82. And I listened to Dr. Aisha on the Connection Program, upon which I had my full admiration for him. Currently, I'm the Executive Director for Free Africa Foundation, and we are promoting democracy in all over African continent. My comment first, brief comments, is a metaphor of the bushfires. And I know every African here knows the difference between the domesticated fowls and the bush fowls. The bush fowls, they feed on the peasant farmer's farm after the farmers have left the farm. And they are very, very territorial. The farm does not belong to any one of those bush fowls. But if one family of bush fowls meet another family of bush fowls on the same farm, they fight the whole night. Again, I'm making this metaphor as our problem in the continental Africa. Both religions, Christianity and Islam, were imported into Africa. We had our own traditions. The third one was the colonization. So we had 3 bushfowls instead of 2 bushfowls. And they've been fighting with each other. We secured our independence from colonialism, so at least 1 bushfowl was killed, but then the 2 bushfowls were left.
Influence is still
So I want you to address the problem of African politics, whether it is in Nigeria, whether it's in Ghana, as to the importation of these foreign religions and what happened to our traditions.
Thank you. Yes, Peter Eke.
Peter Eke, I'm a participant in the conference here. I wonder whether the panel can take this matter beyond Nigeria in the following way. I once visited Tunisia for a conference. I went to Tunis for a conference, and I was surprised. I was served wine. It's a Muslim country. I was served wine by a woman in a hotel. I mean, there didn't seem to be anything extraordinary about that. On the other hand, I understand that you can't do that in Sudan. And my question to you is, where are we going? I mean, Islam was not invented in Nigeria. What country, what models outside of Nigeria are we looking at?
Okay, thank you. I don't know if I can get you all in, but this is question.
Jones Pauli from the Harvard Law School. I teach the course on Islamic law in Africa. And when the riots broke out in Nigeria, we discussed in great detail 2 points in one class. And one was that under the classical law, Islamic law does not, or perhaps should not, be enforced by a state government. It's a question of the fuqaha, the qadis, and the jurist. And the second point was that when a group of Muslims feel that something that has gone wrong has to be corrected, there is a very strict procedure. One goes through protests, one goes through demonstrations, and the last resort is to violence. And when one is even thinking about violence, one has to get permission from the ruler. So my question to you is to whether you think that it is time, or whether there is a way of having a massive campaign in Nigeria to get at what you would call the average Muslim mind about these 2 very important aspects of Islamic law, if one wants to be truly classical about enforcing it.
Okay, let's be as quick as we can, and then we'll stop with, maybe I can get 3 in if they're short. Okay.
Good evening. My name is Akal Chijioke. I'm a student at the graduate school. And my question is about the idea of a sovereign national conference in Nigeria, which was mentioned briefly in the panel. It's just in context of the comments saying that Nigeria is being held hostage by a generation or a gender, and the other comment that Nigeria will continue to exist as long as there is a convergence of the interests of elites from various parts of the country. Is the idea of a sovereign national conference in the minds of the panelists something that is not in the interests of the elites? Is it something that is not in the interests of keeping Nigeria together? Is the idea of keeping Nigeria together something that is not in the interests of the common man, but only of the elites?
Thank you.
I'm next.
Yeah, I know, you'll be last.
My name is Steve Shea. I'm from Boston. I was reading the New York Times from today on page 810 in World Briefing, and it quotes Nigerian Nobel Prize winner in literature Wole Soyinka. He writes, "In this country, religion is being used, and it has been used for short-sighted, narrow-minded political ends. This is not how to practice religion. This is sheer scramble for domination, authority." Would you comment, please?
Okay. Final question.
Thank you. I just have a simple question, and I'll make it brief. I'm curious to know...
Why don't you identify yourself first?
Okay, my name is Deborah Kaufman. I have no association with this university. I'm at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. I'll be graduating in English and Political Science in June, God willing. Okay, now the question is, I was very interested to know it was mentioned the variables that are more or less the impetus for Sharia in Nigeria currently. They were mentioned as being the following. Number one, mass poverty, massive insecurity and corruption being the variables pushing for Sharia. And to me, immediately when I hear these, I think this is, when I look at Sharia, I would consider it a band-aid given these kind of variables, the magnitude of these variables. But this is just my view. So I'm curious to know for, I think, two of you on the panel all are Muslims. Do you believe that the Sharia is the solution for these magnanimous problems that the country faces? Or if it's not, is it just a band-aid, like I think it is? If you could respond to that, please.
Okay. Thank you. Why don't we come up this way?
Do I respond to each or to the last?
No, you respond to anything you want to respond to, and you can't cover them all because we don't have time. So
let me start with the last.
Think of a few minutes.
Last intervention. Yes, Sharia as practiced now, in my view, is not the solution to the problem, because, like we pointed out earlier, it has been hijacked by politicians and is being used to the consternation of many. Massive corruption, ineptitude, and dishonesty is going on in even this self-professed Sharia states. I was just telling someone that, I was in Mecca just this Ramadan, and one of the staunch proponents of Sharia, the governor, was staying in a $10,000 hotel a night. At the end of Ramadan, the hotels in Mecca get very exorbitantly, and there's a very beautiful hotel just a couple of, just not less than a minute to the holy mosques, and he was staying there with public funds, I suppose. And he built one of the mightiest of mansions in his hometown, and it became a scandal. A lot of people focused on it, but for Muslims, it's a wait and watch type of situation. So ideally, Sharia ought to, cleanse the system, and that is what this average person that we keep talking about expects. So I do not think that Sharia as practiced now will solve the problem. Now, in terms of the first question, why is this happening now? Why this agitation? Why this upheaval? Why did it happen during General Obasanjo's time? You can speculate about several reasons, but I do believe that just like the Kaduna riots, the Miss World riots in Kaduna, the large portion of it, of course, the destruction, not the loss of human life, was the property of the governor. The property of the governor of the state was burned. A supermarket, he built a supermarket. You can interpret it, you can say it's his political enemies. You can say is that people felt, why should a serving governor during his tenure build one of the major supermarkets in his town? So the violence, what cannot be explained is this violence, sporadic, random, senseless, brutal violence that takes place from both sides. The highway between Kaduna and Abuja, anytime riots takes place in Kaduna, that highway will be overtaken by both the vanguards of the two religions. And most of these vanguards are young, unemployed youth, and if you come, no question asked, they will just either behead you or burn you. It doesn't matter who you are. You know, if you fall into the wrong, if you're a Muslim, you go to the wrong Christian hands, they kill you. No question asked. Whether you are from Kaduna, whether you're part of the problem, if you are a Christian and you happen to be just in the wrong place at the wrong time, you just kill. So that issue of random violence is not only limited to religious conflicts. In Lagos, you cannot go to certain neighborhoods, whether you are Christian or Muslim. And that sense of insecurity is heightening in Nigeria, and we must find a solution to it. Now the comment, I will leave the other comments to my esteemed colleagues to respond, but the comment as to, which one is this?
We can.
Is there any positive side to the implementation of the Sharia in some of these states? Well, I don't know. So there's not been really scrutiny or study so far to indicate that. Until you really get sober moments, people will reflect and say, well, at the moment you cannot really, that's my view, you cannot point out there had been preferences for certain people because of the quick process of the Sharia in certain minor legal cases. You know, the question of indebtedness, you know, Christian will just take his fellow Muslim litigant and say, well, he owes me money, and the Sharia judge will say, pay him. That's it, and it is done. Those type of really minor things, but in fundamentally changing the life of the people, I don't know. There's still a lot of questions to be asked.
Good, thank you. Aya?
I think that, to me, the key has to be in the sovereign national conference. I appreciate that it may not be the fashionable view in Abuja, simply because I think that if we have a sovereign national conference, the power of Abuja is that is the central government is bound to be weakened. But, and I also think that because it is not possible now to have that debate only amongst men, in other words, the voices of Northern women will be heard in such a debate. I think that the outcome may be more favorable, and I don't believe that it will ipso facto lead to the breakup of Nigeria, so I'm not worried about a sovereign national conference. I do think, as I said, that it should start from the bottom up rather than just everybody gathering at the center, when indeed all we will do is argue about Sharia and it will all be heat and no light. The generation issue, I must say I'm not an ageist, and the fact is that it is people like our former head of state, General Gowon, who are responsible for this, because these old men haven't had their chance. They've been, you know, waiting, and military rule has come in and stopped them from sort of getting, you know, so they don't feel they're past their sell-by date because they're still in the freezer. They've been in the freezer. And unfortunately, even now, the whole debate about who is taking over is about ex-general this, ex-general that, ex-colonel. I mean, you know, it's pathetic. So that it's not just a generation; it's actually a class or a particular group of people. That is the military turned civilian politicians. As to the, I think really, quite frankly, that the biggest danger that we face is this army of unemployed young men in the country. And I know that we have unemployed young women, but they're not the threat and danger. And we can see from countries like Sierra Leone and so on, what this, you know, what a devil's workshop this is. The problem is that I'm afraid that I belong to the Dr. Johnson school of things. He was the one who, when writing his dictionary, went to Lord Chesterfield and said, you know, sponsor me, and the man said, no. But when the thing was nearing completion, Lord Chesterfield now said, yes, I'm ready for you. And please, it's not a patron, my lord, somebody who looks on unconcerned while you're struggling in the water, but once you reach the shore, begins to encumber you with his health. And this is how we should be ready for the West. They may be cheering us on from the sidelines, but if we expect them to jump into the water and pull us to the shore, I'm afraid we should not hold our breath. So the reality of the matter is that whatever good wishes there are, we have to, there's just no point in saying the West should do this, because you're already, quite frankly, abandoning your own future to people who have other agendas and other interests. So that whilst it may be the interest of the West that we should be orderly in Africa and, you know, be progressing and so on, it might not necessarily, you know, be the main thing that is, all politics is local, after all. I think that, again, going back to this, and so I think that we have to find a way, we as individuals in Nigeria, we have to find a way of getting work and I think also education of a broad type. That is to say that even our Sharia judges are largely ignorant of what they are putting in, simply because when you are rushing to implement something, you have to put, it's like the Nigeria Police Force. Incidentally, I'm on the Police Service Commission, not the Public Service Commission. You're putting 40,000 policemen on the street every year. You don't have time to train them. So it's the same thing. You want to implement Sharia law, you've got to find your judges from somewhere. You're not necessarily taking the proper time to train them. And I think that again leads to some of these things, because the problem is that once the sentence is pronounced, then, you know, it creates this heat and so on, so that whereas if the judges were more versed in all the ramifications, then we might not even get into so many of these situations as we have gotten into. So that I think that the need for is education and for discussion, and education even in Islamic law is also very important. There's no doubt that religion is grossly abused in Nigeria, but you know, whatever floats your boat, as they say. This is what gets Nigerians going. I mean, you know, the point about stealing is that it is not, in fact, the Sharia has the question of somebody who steals government funds is said to be a matter of breach of trust. And that actually is what is forcing other people into the situation where they have to start going to steal chickens and goats. So that I think that also needs to be addressed by those who are propounding it. On the other hand, we shouldn't, I think we shouldn't just be so, I have a knee-jerk reaction, but at the same time, if I'm, you know, up for a crime, and they say, well, you can go and relax for 3 months in a Nigerian jail, or possibly a year while we get ready to try you. You know, not necessarily the destination of choice. Maybe you would feel that actually my human rights are better served by a quick flogging or something. I don't know. But I think that we should, and I make this point, I may make it in a light-hearted manner, but I think that these are some of the issues that, because we're all in our mental lagers, whereby we say, oh, this is Islamic punishment, therefore absolutely no, or you know, vice versa. I mean, if somebody's going abroad to pretend to do Hajj and boost his religious thing, and then complains that somebody else is might build a chapel in, you know, State House, then I think, you know, he's got his priorities in the wrong order.
Okay, good. And the last word, Aisha?
Thank you. First of all, on the timing of the Sharia Acts, I'm not personally a proponent of the conspiracy thesis. I think that it might have come up in a number of different ways, but the fact was that until we had civilian rule, governors could not do anything they wanted without the consent of the president. So there just wasn't that political space, whether or not people might have wanted to do it before. I would also point out that there is increasingly reactions of populations that are not in the north and which may not be Muslim around corruption and personal security, which is also manifesting itself in vigilante groups, some of which are also in some states being picked up, the OPC, the Pakasi boys. In that sense, the reaction of the poor to their lack of faith in the ability of the state to protect them and to secure law and order materializes as Hisba groups in the north and as OPC and Bakassi in the south and the west. So what's happening is not totally, this is specific only to the north or to Muslims. Secondly, I think that I would agree that empirically there does seem to be a number of people who are willing to go to the Sharia courts over small issues for which there are not had punishments because it's faster. Okay, so that very clearly is happening. On the issue of what classical fiqh says about Islam being enforced by or about religious laws being enforced by the state and the structure of protests, I think that, well, there are two things there. First of all, in relation to the point that both of you in different ways made about education, there is a general lack of education in the Muslim community in Nigeria as in the non-Muslim community about what classical jurisprudence says, about what Muslim laws have existed in different places, and people hold very tightly to their stereotypes and refuse to let go of them. So, for example, if you say in Nigeria now that actually there is a very strong trend of classical jurisprudence that holds that once a law is enacted, you obey it because it's the law of the state, because your religious law can only be what you personally believe in. So if you don't actually believe that what the state has enacted is how the religion says it should be, then you can't be obeying it for your religious law. You can only be obeying it because it's state law and you're obliged to do it as a citizen, or because you have no choice. But if you say that in Nigeria now, you will be accused of being apostate, I assure you, having experienced it. Similarly with the structure of protest in Islam, again, there's a very strong tradition, and it's part of the Maliki school as well, which surprises me, that talks about the need to speak truth to power. And again, if you say that, they tell you you're being anti the North, anti-Sharia, and are you a Muslim, by the way? So, in relation to the point about Tunisia and Sudan, again, that takes me back to the point that I tried to start with, that is that there is and always has been a lot of different ideas about how to translate the text of the Quran, or indeed the examples of the Prophet's life, into laws that will be implemented and enforced by society in any particular time and place. So if I take, the issue of polygyny, for example, the marriage of a man to more than one woman at a time, the verses of the Quran say something like, if you feel that you cannot do justice to the orphans, then marry of the women of your hand 2, 3, up to 4, but you must treat them equally, but this is not possible, therefore it's better to marry only one. Okay, now, in Tunisia, they focus on the last bit, therefore it's better to marry only one, and polygyny and monogamy is the norm. Polygyny is not sanctioned by the law, and it's Muslim law. In Nigeria, in Senegal, they say, okay, but the woman should have a choice about it. So before they get married, the man has to say, I'm going to be monogamous, or I'm going to have 2 wives, or 3 wives, or 4 wives. So she has the chance of saying, well, since I don't want to be in a polygynous marriage, I'm not going to marry you. Okay? In Nigeria, the woman has no choice, sometimes no knowledge that she's about to have a co-wife. And in some sections of Nigeria, I have to say, in some parts of Kano, where I come from, you will hear the argument that in order to be like the Prophet, Muslim men must be polygynous, although the Prophet himself was monogamous in his first marriage until sadly Khadija died. And they don't say that either. But the point is, it's not that there are not actually many different interpretations, some of which are dominant, some of which are less dominant, and a lot of the arguments that people are talking about now in my particular field of work about gender equality were not made only in the 21st century by the Gregorian calendar. They were made as early as the Prophet's time and immediately afterwards, but they never achieved power. So the issue is not, does Islam do this or that? It's what do Muslims do in the name of Islam And there has always been a question and a power struggle about that. And so to the extent that in Nigeria, the people who are trying to close off debate are currently dominant, there is going to be continued abuse of religion, in this case Islam, but it's happening also, I grant, in Christian fundamentalist communities as well. Then there will be the continued abuse of religion, so that what we need is precisely that education, that opening up of discussion and debate that grants that the raising of issues is not from malice, and often is not from ignorance either, but that needs to be taken seriously and respectfully.
Fabulous panel. Thank you all so much.
You're welcome.